Magandang gabi sa ating lahat. Ngayong gabi, ang pag-aaralan natin is the sufficiency of God's grace. So, ang talata natin pagbubulayan ngayong gabi ay 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9. So, sabi dito, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Diyos ang magpapala sa mga kasalitaan sa ating nagbubulay-bulayan sa araw na ito. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9, Paul shares a profound revelation about the sufficiency of God's grace in the midst of suffering. So what is our teachings sa gabi na ito? So una, God does not always remove our sufferings. So despite Paul's plea for the removal of his thorn in the flesh, God's response reveals that He may not always eliminate our sufferings. Sufferings is a reality of life in a fallen world, but God's purposes extend beyond mere relief from pain to a deeper work of grace within us. Second is God's grace is always sufficient. So in every trial and hardship, God's grace is more than enough to sustain us. His grace is not limited by the magnitude of our difficulties, but transcends them, providing strength, comfort, and hope even in the darkest of times. It is a constant source of support and encouragement, enabling us to endure and overcome whatever challenges we may face. Third is God's power imperfect in our weaknesses. Paradoxically, it is our weaknesses that God's power is most clearly manifested. When we acknowledge our limitation and inadequacies, we open ourselves to the supernatural strength and provision of God. His power shines brightest against the backdrop of our frailty, bringing glory to His name and demonstrating His faithfulness to sustain and uphold us. So what is our applications here? Practical applications of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9 include: pray for more of God's grace to strengthen us. In times of weakness and adversity, earnestly seek God's grace through prayer. Ask Him to pour out His abundant grace upon you, granting you the strength and endurance to persevere through every trial and hardship. Second is consider suffering as an opportunity for God's grace to work in us. Instead of viewing suffering as a hindrance or obstacle, reframe your perspective to see it as an opportunity for God's grace to be magnified in your life. Embrace the refining work of grace that occurs amidst trials, knowing that God can use even the most difficult circumstances for His glory and our ultimate good. Third is trust the sufficiency of God's grace. Cultivate a deep-seated trust in the sufficiency of God's grace. Rest assured that His grace is more than enough to meet your every need and to carry you through every season of life. Lean into His grace, that unwavering faith, knowing that He is faithful to His promises and will never leave you nor forsake you. So what is our discussion sa gabing ito? Particularly sa 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9. So practically applying the sufficiency of God's grace in our daily walk with God involves first, dependence on God in prayer. Regularly communing with God in prayer. So we acknowledge our dependence on His grace and seek His strength to navigate life's challenges. Second is mindset shift regarding suffering. So instead of viewing suffering solely as a negative experience to be avoided, we recognize it as an opportunity for God's grace to be demonstrated in our lives. So this shift in mindset enables us to face adversity with hope and trust in God's provision. Third is acting in faith. Trusting in the sufficiency of God's grace requires action. It involves stepping out in faith even when circumstances seem overwhelming, knowing that God's grace will sustain us and His power will be made perfect in our weaknesses. Fourth and last is living in gratitude. So cultivating an attitude of gratitude for God's grace allows us to continually acknowledge His goodness and provision in our lives, even amidst trials and difficulties. Ultimately, applying the sufficiency of God's grace involves an ongoing surrender of our will and unwavering trust in His promises, knowing that His grace is more than enough to carry us through every season of life.